They tried to turn patience into a weapon against a man who had already mastered silence as a form of control, not realizing that the more they pushed, the more the entire room would begin to bend under his stillness. What started as a calculated test quickly shifted into something far more dangerous because the person they chose was not someone who reacted the normal way to pressure. Bruce Lee entered the room already aware that the atmosphere was not ordinary, because the people who had invited him were not fans but observers looking for cracks in his calm discipline, and they had built the entire situation as a psychological test designed to push his patience beyond limits, expecting that even the legendary discipline of Bruce Lee would eventually show irritation. But what they did not understand was that his silence was not emptiness, it was control, and every breath he took was measured like a trained strike waiting for the perfect moment rather than reaction. The room itself felt like it was being studied instead of him being evaluated, because Bruce Lee had mastered the art of turning pressure into awareness, and the more they tried to provoke him, the more he seemed to dissolve into stillness that made others uncomfortable with their own intentions. As the silence stretched further, one of the men finally decided to escalate the situation by stepping closer and speaking in a tone meant to disrupt concentration. But Bruce Lee did not respond immediately. Instead, he observed the rhythm of the interruption as if it were part of training rather than confrontation, analyzing the timing, the posture, and the subtle hesitation in the aggressor movement. Without breaking eye contact, he allowed the tension to rise naturally because he understood that chaos reveals character more than comfort ever could. And in that controlled environment, he was already 3 steps ahead, mentally mapping every possible outcome while maintaining an expression that gave nothing away to those who believed they were in control. The intention behind the so-called test was to provoke a reaction strong enough to break discipline, but what they encountered instead was a deeper layer of composure that seemed almost unnatural to them because every insult, every gesture, every deliberate attempt to disturb him was absorbed and redirected internally into focus rather than frustration. As the observers began to realize that the situation was no longer about testing him, but about revealing their own inability to unsettle a mind trained beyond ordinary limits, and the room grew heavier with every passing second as expectations collapsed into uncertainty, while Bruce Lee remained motionless yet fully aware of everything unfolding around him. In that fragile balance between pressure and patience, he continued to read the situation like a moving pattern rather than a fixed threat, noticing micro-expressions, shifts in breathing, and the way doubt began to spread among those who had planned the test as their confidence slowly eroded without any physical confrontation ever being initiated because Bruce Lee's presence alone was enough to turn their strategy inward, forcing them to confront the silence they had underestimated while he remained still, observing every shift without giving them the satisfaction of reaction. The air itself seemed to tighten as their plan began to unravel silently in real time. The moment the silence stopped feeling like a strategy to them, it started feeling like a pressure they could no longer control, and that was when the entire atmosphere of the room began to shift in a way none of them had prepared for. What was supposed to be a structured psychological test slowly turned into an unbalanced situation where confidence no longer had a clear place to stand. Each person involved in the setup had entered with the belief that they would be the ones controlling the emotional rhythm of the encounter, but instead they found themselves adjusting to something far more unsettling. Because the man they were trying to provoke was not reacting in any predictable pattern. Bruce Lee remained seated, but the meaning of his stillness had changed in their perception. At first, they interpreted his silence as passive endurance, something that would eventually crack under sustained pressure. Yet as time extended, that interpretation began to collapse. The testers started exchanging subtle glances, small movements of uncertainty creeping into their posture, and the earlier confidence that had filled the room began to erode into hesitation. Even the way they spoke to each other changed, becoming shorter, less certain, as if the air itself was no longer supporting their original plan. One of them attempted to regain control by increasing the intensity of the situation, speaking louder. Pushing more direct remarks meant to provoke a visible reaction, but instead of breaking the silence, it only exposed the instability of the attempt. The more force they applied, the more uneven the environment became, as though the pressure was no longer moving toward Bruce Lee but bouncing back into the group itself. It was at this stage that the psychological imbalance became clear. They were no longer testing his patience. They were testing their own ability to remain composed under the weight of their own expectations. Small details started to matter more than intended. A slight pause before someone spoke, a shift in seating position, a quick glance away from eye contact. These minor signals began to multiply in meaning inside the room. What was once a controlled setup now felt like an unfolding breakdown of coordination. Bruce Lee's lack of reaction did not create emptiness. It created reflection, and that reflection was uncomfortable for those who had built confidence on the assumption of dominance. As the tension deepened, the group started losing synchronization, no longer acting as a unified force but as individuals, reacting differently to the same silence. Some became impatient, others cautious, and a few visibly uncertain about continuing the test at all. The atmosphere that had been designed to expose weakness was now exposing inconsistency among the testers themselves. Every second that passed without a reaction from Bruce Lee increased the internal pressure within the group, turning their strategy into something unstable and unpredictable, as the control they believed they had carefully constructed began slipping, through gaps they never noticed forming until it was already too late. A quiet shift occurred that none of the participants immediately noticed, because everyone in the room was still focused on the surface-level idea that the test was about provoking a reaction. But in reality, something far more subtle was unfolding beneath it, something that only a trained eye or a deeply observant mind would begin to recognize. Among the group, there was one individual who was not as vocal or as aggressive as the others, someone positioned slightly apart from the main circle of testers, watching not just the man at the center but the entire structure of the situation itself. And while others were becoming increasingly consumed by their own attempts to break the silence, this observer began to question the purpose of what they were witnessing. Bruce Lee remained unchanged in posture, but to this observer his silence did not resemble resistance or submission. It resembled something more refined, something closer to intentional calibration, as if every second of stillness was not empty but filled with observation. And that realization began to alter the way the observer interpreted the entire room. While the others saw a man refusing to react, this individual started to see a man collecting information without moving, reading not just words or tones but the emotional structure behind them, and the idea that silence itself could be an active form of engagement rather than absence started to take shape in his mind. As the others continued their attempts to provoke a response, the observer noticed how predictable their behavior had become, how each escalation followed a pattern of impatience rather than strategy, and how every attempt to dominate the interaction revealed more about their internal need for control than about the person they were testing. In contrast, Bruce Lee's stillness created a kind of mirror effect, reflecting back intention without distortion, forcing those in the room to confront not what they wanted to see but what they were actually projecting. And this is where the observer began to understand that the purpose of the silence was not endurance, but exposure. The more the situation progressed, the clearer it became that the test was no longer functioning in the direction it was intended to, because instead of revealing cracks in Bruce Lee's patience, it was revealing cracks in the structure of the experiment itself, and the observer began to notice small but significant details that others were too emotionally invested to see, such as how the group's coordination was slowly dissolving, how leadership within the testers was becoming uncertain, and how even their confidence was no longer shared equally but scattered unevenly across individuals who were now reacting to each other almost as much as they were reacting to the silence in the room. At one point, the observer realized that the real subject of the test had quietly shifted without anyone formally acknowledging it, because what was being measured was no longer Bruce Lee's reaction time or emotional response, but the tester's ability to maintain stability in the presence of unbroken composure. And that realization carried a subtle weight, because it reframed the entire encounter from an evaluation of one man into an unintended examination of many minds under pressure, and in that reframing, the silence stopped being a void and became a force that reorganized perception itself, while Bruce Lee continued to sit,